My name is Ruth Anderson, and this is my story. I am 72 years old, an American mother who believed that love, patience, and sacrifice were enough to protect a woman in her old age. I live alone in a quiet town called Cedar Falls, Iowa, a place where winters stretch for months and the winds carry whispers through the bare trees. I always thought silence meant peace, until silence became my punishment, my companion, and my enemy all at once. Dear listener, thank you so much for tuning in. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and let me know in the comments what country you are listening from. I truly appreciate it. Enjoy the story. This house, with its chipped paint and creaking floors, was never meant to be so quiet. There was a time when its walls echoed with footsteps, laughter, and the high-pitched cries of a little boy running through the hallway. Every corner holds memories, the smell of Sunday morning pancakes, the sound of Michael yelling for me to come quick, the muddy shoes lining the front porch, and the warmth of a hand gripping mine while we walked home from school. Now, I walk through these rooms alone, listening to the floorboards groan under my weight, apologizing to the house for growing old inside it, for filling it with silence instead of voices. I built this life with my husband, Thomas Anderson, who passed away suddenly more than 2 decades ago. He was a man of quiet strength, a carpenter who believed that a home was more than wood and nails, it was love, trust, and the people who waited inside. I still remember his voice, low and soft, saying, "Ruth, the house is nothing without those who belong to it." When he left me with Michael, only 16 at the time, I swore I would never let that house feel empty. My son's name is Michael Anderson, and he was the reason I endured everything that came after. I raised him alone, working multiple jobs, never complaining. Mothers like me learn early that strength is quiet, that endurance is a daily choice, and that sometimes, love means hiding your pain so your child never carries it. I cleaned offices during the day, served coffee at night, and folded laundry in the early hours of the morning. Every scar on my hands told a story of survival, every wrinkle on my face a chapter of devotion. When Michael announced he wanted to join the United States Army, I smiled through my tears. My heart screamed at me to hold him close, to beg him not to leave, but I swallowed my fear. He is meant for something greater than me, greater than this small town, greater than the life I have tried to protect him in. I packed his uniform carefully, kissed him on the forehead, and whispered prayers into his hair every night before he left. Before his first deployment, Michael married Laura, a woman I initially welcomed with open arms. She was young, stunning, confident, the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. At first, I thought perhaps my fears were just the jealousy of an old mother, the insecurities of a woman growing quiet in her own home. But Laura was different. Her smiles never reached her eyes when she looked at me. Her polite words masked a coldness I could feel in my bones. And yet, I said nothing. I held my silence like armor, telling myself it was better to endure than create conflict while my son was halfway across the world, facing dangers I could not even imagine. The first signs of her cruelty were subtle, almost invisible. She moved my things without asking. She corrected me in front of visitors, questioned my cooking, and spoke to me as if I were an intruder in my own home. "You should be grateful," she once said, standing in the doorway of my room. "Most women your age would be in a nursing home, not here in this house." I didn't respond. I retreated further into myself, learning which corners of the house were safe, which hours were mine to exist without comment, and which footsteps would herald her scrutiny. Evenings were the hardest. I would sit by the window, staring at the empty road outside, imagining Michael walking home instead of being thousands of miles away. I could almost hear his voice, clear and commanding, saying, "Mom, everything's going to be okay." And yet, it wasn't. The walls of this house began to feel like a cage, and Laura's presence was the lock on the door. I started shrinking. I whispered when I spoke, moved only when necessary, and ate my meals in silence. The life I had once built, full of warmth and laughter, had been replaced with tension and fear. I was an old woman, yet I felt invisible, as though the years of sacrifice and devotion were meaningless in her eyes. I asked myself repeatedly why Michael hadn't left someone like her behind. But I reminded myself he was a soldier, not yet home to witness the small cruelties, not yet ready to fight for his mother in a different way. One night, Laura pushed my patience to its limit. I was organizing the kitchen, carefully placing dishes in the cupboards, when she walked in. "You're taking up too much space," she said, her tone casual but dripping with venom. I froze, staring at her. "I'm just putting things away," I replied softly, hoping my voice wouldn't betray the fear that had started to curl in my stomach. "No," she said, "you're making this house your own. But it's not yours. Michael and I run this house now." Her words hit me like a slap I had waited decades for. Not because of their cruelty, but because of the indifference. The absolute certainty that I, who had raised the man she loved, had no place here. I retreated to my room that night and cried, quietly, so she wouldn't hear. And as I wept, I realized something profound. I was no longer the mother in control of my home. I was a witness to its takeover, powerless, waiting for the day Michael would return and see what had been done. Days turned into weeks. Laura's cruelty escalated. She would criticize my clothes, my way of speaking, my habits. The smallest mistakes became evidence of my inadequacy. I avoided her, tiptoed around her moods, and endured each insult as if it were a test of my endurance. And yet, despite the fear, I felt a quiet determination growing within me. I will not be broken. I have survived worse. I have loved fiercely and lost fiercely. This is temporary. I began to document everything. The insults, the manipulations, the hours I spent alone while she prowled the rooms like a queen in her castle. I wrote in notebooks, not for her, not even for Michael, yet, but for myself. A record of survival, proof that I had not disappeared quietly into defeat. I thought back to my husband, Thomas, and his words, "A house is nothing without those who belong to it." He had built this home with love and intention. He had left me a legacy far more powerful than walls or wood. And I realized, finally, that this house could not be taken from me, not by a young wife, not by fear, not even by time itself. I do not know how long I would have endured in silence if fate had not decided otherwise. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Michael, carried across continents. My hands shook as I opened it. His handwriting, familiar and steady, spoke of courage, battle, and longing. But among his words, there was something unexpected, concern, piercing and urgent, for the mother he left behind. He had finally heard, somehow, the truth of what had been happening. And in that moment, I knew things were about to change. The balance of power, the quiet suffering, the invisible mother, it would all end when he returned. Because some truths, no matter how long buried, find their way to the surface. And some mothers, no matter how quiet, have a son willing to fight for justice, even when the battle begins at home. Life in Cedar Falls, Iowa had never felt so heavy. Each morning I awoke to the sound of the wind rattling the windows, a reminder that the world outside was moving on while I remained trapped inside my own home. I had learned the harsh truth that being invisible is not a blessing, it is a silent punishment. After Michael left for deployment, Laura's presence became a constant shadow over my existence. She was meticulous in her cruelty, small acts designed to remind me that I was nothing in her eyes. She moved my belongings, rearranged the furniture I had placed with care, and spoke to me in a tone that was sweet on the surface but laced with scorn. "Mom, you should really try harder," she said one day, as if correcting the life I had lived for decades was a game. I learned to disappear. I moved quietly, ate quietly, spoke only when necessary. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and laughter, became my battleground. I would prepare my meals while she watched, her eyes calculating every motion. Sometimes, she would mock me in subtle ways, like pointing out that I was using the wrong utensil or that the soup wasn't seasoned perfectly. It was a slow, relentless erosion of dignity, a test of endurance I had never signed up for. Yet, despite the humiliation, I held my head high. For Michael, for the son I had raised to be brave, disciplined, and honorable. I told myself that this was temporary, that my suffering was small compared to the battles he faced overseas. I whispered prayers for him every night, praying for his safety and his return, hoping that the distance between us would shield him from the truth I kept hidden. Days turned into weeks, and Laura's behavior escalated. She would leave passive-aggressive notes on the fridge, rearranging my personal items and dismissing my contributions to the home. I could no longer find comfort in the rooms I had once loved. The house felt foreign, even though every wall, every corner, every floorboard carried memories of my family. It was as if she were trying to erase my existence, one small act at a time. I found solace only in my journal, a simple leather-bound notebook where I recorded every insult, every slight, every moment of silent suffering. Writing became my rebellion, a way to assert my presence when words spoken aloud were met with derision. I documented not for Michael, not for Laura, but for myself. A record of survival, a proof that I had not surrendered completely, even when the world around me suggested I should. One particularly cold morning, I noticed a pile of my winter clothes in the laundry room. Laura had thrown them there, saying that they were taking up too much space. I quietly retrieved them, folding each piece with care, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. The sense of being erased, of being made to feel invisible in my own home, weighed heavily on me. I had raised a soldier, taught him courage, honor, and compassion, but what of my own courage? Could I endure this silent battle without breaking? The days were long, and the nights even longer. I often sat by the window, staring at the barren trees, the icy roads, the distant hills. I imagined Michael walking those roads with me, feeling the warmth of his presence beside me. I imagined him returning home, seeing the life I had maintained alone, and finally understanding the quiet suffering I endured in his absence. It was during one of these long evenings that I realized the depth of my own resilience. In a house that had become a prison, with a daughter-in-law who sought to dominate every aspect of my existence. And yet, I was still here. Still breathing. Still refusing to let the weight of her cruelty define me. Laura's manipulations were becoming more brazen. She would invite guests over, making sure I was excluded from conversations, laughing at jokes that I was supposed to ignore, and speaking over me whenever I tried to contribute. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of humiliation, designed to remind me of my place in the household. I learned to time my movements, to know when to speak and when to remain silent, to preserve what dignity I could in the face of relentless control. And then came the whispers from neighbors, the subtle comments, the sideways glances. I realized that Laura had begun painting a picture of me as a meddlesome, difficult older woman, someone who had no right to occupy the home that her son now shared with her. It was a painful realization that cruelty can extend beyond the walls of a home, that manipulation can ripple through a community, shaping perceptions and isolating the victim further. But I refused to be defeated. Each night, as I wrote in my journal, I reminded myself of the values I had instilled in Michael. I remembered the man he had become, the soldier, the son, the protector. Somewhere out there, he was fighting battles that I could never witness, and yet his courage inspired me to endure the battles within my own home. Weeks turned into months. Laura's cruelty did not waver, it intensified. She would criticize my cooking, my appearance, my manners. She would speak as though I were invisible, yet ensure that her words cut deeply. I began to understand that her power lay not in overt aggression, but in the quiet, insidious manipulation that made me question my own reality. One day, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Laura entered with a haughty smile. "Mom, you really shouldn't try so hard," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're making yourself look foolish." I froze, feeling a mix of anger and despair, but I said nothing. I had learned that silence could be both a shield and a weapon. I continued folding the clothes, letting the quiet strength I had cultivated over decades hold me steady. As winter deepened, the isolation grew. I found myself speaking to the walls, to the empty rooms, to the memories of my husband and the laughter of my son. It was a way to survive, a way to maintain a sense of self when the presence of another sought to erase me. I began to plan, quietly, a future in which truth would emerge, in which justice would be served, not through confrontation, but through the return of the son I had raised to fight for what was right. Letters from Michael became my lifeline. Each one carried news of distant lands, battles fought, and the longing to return home. And yet, among his words, I began to notice hints of concern. Questions that hinted he had heard whispers of the life I endured in his absence. Questions that would soon lead him to the truth. And in that moment, I understood that patience, endurance, and silent strength were not enough. The day would come when the son I had raised would witness the injustice, when the truth would emerge, and when the power dynamics of our household would shift irrevocably. For now, I endured. For now, I waited. I survived in silence, finding strength in memory, in love, and in the unwavering hope that Michael would return, not just as a soldier, but as the protector of his mother and the arbiter of justice. Because some truths, no matter how long hidden, will find their way to the surface. And some mothers, no matter how quiet, have a son willing to fight for what is right, even if the battlefield is within the walls of the home they once shared. I had grown used to silence. Cedar Falls, Iowa, with its quiet streets and endless stretches of snow-covered fields, had become my world, my prison, and my solace all at once. I, Ruth Anderson, had learned the rhythm of a life overshadowed by someone else's cruelty. Every day, every hour, was a careful dance: move, speak, exist only when necessary, avoid attention. But that rhythm was about to change. It began with the letters from Michael. At first, they were the usual updates: a soldier's life in brief, recounting training exercises, missions completed, friends lost and found, and the occasional memory of home. I cherished them, clipping each envelope carefully, storing them in a drawer where I could revisit his words when loneliness pressed too heavily against my chest. But soon, the tone of the letters shifted, subtle at first, like the changing of the wind before a storm. "Mom," one letter began, "I hope you're taking care of yourself. I've heard things, and I need to understand. Are you okay, truly?" My hands shook as I read those words. How could he know? How could anyone know what had been happening while he was away, halfway across the world, sleeping on dirt and steel, fighting battles I could barely imagine? I reread the letter a dozen times, each time my heart pounding with fear and hope. For the first time, I sensed that the truth might not be buried forever. Laura, of course, remained unchanged in her cruelty. She moved through the house with the same calculated grace, as if daring me to exist, daring me to breathe. Her smirks were sharper, her words more precise, each syllable a reminder of my supposed inferiority. She controlled every corner of my life, my meals, my movements, the very air I breathed. She wanted the house, the sun, and me entirely under her control. I had endured much, but the letters reminded me of the day justice might finally arrive. Each sentence from Michael carried a weight I hadn't felt in years, the weight of his care, of his growing awareness. He was not the boy I had tucked into bed so many years ago. He was a man, disciplined, commanding, and increasingly aware that something in his home was wrong. One evening, I prepared my supper carefully, placing it on the table. Laura entered just as I set the dishes down, her eyes narrowing in amusement. "Mom, you're making too much food again. You're only feeding yourself," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp, her posture poised to dominate. I swallowed my fear and replied softly, "I prefer to eat properly." She laughed lightly, though it was the kind of laugh that carried contempt, a whisper of amusement at someone else's discomfort. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that. But it's useless here." I ignored her, knowing that silence had become my shield. But that night, when the house finally fell quiet and the snow pressed against the windows like an icy reminder of isolation, I opened Michael's newest letter. He had written about the town, about the streets he remembered walking as a child, about the smell of our home. But at the bottom, there was a question I could not ignore. "Mom, has Laura been treating you well? Please, be honest. I need to know the truth. I can't protect you from here, but I can act if I know what's happening." My heart ached. He had heard whispers. Someone had told him, or perhaps intuition had guided him. But how could I confess the full extent of the cruelty? How could I explain months, even years, of subtle torment, the isolation, the mockery, the relentless efforts to make me feel small in my own home? That night, I wrote back. Carefully, truthfully, but with caution. I described Laura's control, her words, her manipulations. I wrote about the nights I spent crying quietly, about the way the house seemed to shrink around me. I did not exaggerate, nor did I spare her cruelty. I wrote as a mother who had endured, who had survived, and who hoped that her son, once he returned, would understand the injustice. Sending that letter was an act of courage I had not felt in years. It was a small rebellion, a spark of hope in a life that had become routine survival. And it was the beginning of change. Days passed, and my anxiety grew. Every sound in the house, every step on the creaking floor, reminded me of Laura's presence. She was sharp, attentive, and increasingly suspicious. "What are you writing, Mom?" she asked casually one afternoon, peering over my shoulder. I froze, pretending to adjust the page. "Just notes," I said softly, my voice calm. Her eyes narrowed. "Notes? For who?" I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that concealed layers of resilience. "Just for myself," I replied. "Memories, thoughts, nothing important." She looked at me for a long moment, then walked away. But I knew she suspected something. That suspicion made her more dangerous. The snow began to fall harder, blanketing Cedar Falls in white. The world outside was silent, but the house inside was tense, fragile, and charged with unspoken truths. I continued my routines, keeping my distance, documenting every insult, every act of manipulation. I had become a ghost in my own home, present yet unseen, enduring yet vigilant. And then, one cold evening, the mailbox rattled. I rushed to retrieve it, my hands trembling. There, in Michael's handwriting, was a letter marked urgent. "Mom, I need you to tell me everything. I am coming home. I cannot wait. Laura's behavior cannot continue. I need the truth." My hands shook as I held the envelope. The day I had been waiting for, the day when the injustice might end, was approaching. I could feel it in my bones. Michael was returning, and with him, the power to confront, to correct, and to restore what had been taken. I spent that night preparing. I placed my letters, my journals, and my notes where I could find them. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would explain months of suffering without exaggeration, without fear. I knew the confrontation would come, not with anger, but with the calm, measured authority of a son who had learned to fight for justice. Laura, of course, remained unaware of the storm approaching. She continued her careful domination, confident that she had silenced me completely. But she had underestimated the bond between mother and son, the resilience that comes from years of silent endurance, and the inevitability of truth. The days that followed were filled with tension, anticipation, and quiet preparation. Every letter from Michael reinforced the knowledge that change was imminent. Every act of Laura's control reminded me why patience, endurance, and meticulous documentation were necessary. I realized, in those long, silent nights, that I had not just survived, I had prepared. I had created a record, a story, and a path for justice. The day Michael returned, the balance of power would shift. The truth would surface, and the house that had felt like a prison would witness the restoration of dignity, honor, and love. Because no cruelty, no matter how calculated, can withstand the return of a son armed with awareness, courage, and the desire to protect the mother who gave him life. And some mothers, no matter how silent, carry the strength to endure until that moment arrives. The snow had softened the edges of Cedar Falls, Iowa, covering the streets in white and making the world outside look serene. But inside my house, serenity was the last thing on anyone's mind. And I had spent months in quiet endurance, documenting every insult, every manipulation, and every subtle attempt to erase me from my own home. It was early morning when the first letter arrived, marked urgent. My hands trembled as I opened it, and I read the words over and over. "Mom, I'm coming home. I leave tomorrow. Tell me everything I need to know about Laura. I will not let this continue." My heart leapt and sank at the same time. Finally, Michael was returning. The son I had raised with care, who had grown into a man of discipline, courage, and honor, would witness the truth. My relief was tempered by fear, fear for what would happen when the confrontation came, fear for the violence that words can sometimes unleash, fear for my own frailty in the face of the storm that would arrive. Laura, of course, remained blissfully unaware. She went about her routines, her smirk always poised, her movements deliberate. She had no idea that the letters, carefully written, had reached Michael's hands and that the son she thought was oblivious was now armed with the knowledge of every slight, every cruel word, and every manipulation she had inflicted upon me. The night before Michael's arrival, I barely slept. I went through the house, placing letters and journals in the places I hoped he would see them, rehearsing what I would say, and preparing my heart to speak the truth. It had been months of silence, endurance, and invisible suffering, but now, the end of this quiet torment was near. Morning arrived with a sharp chill. I could hear the faint crunch of snow under tires as Michael's vehicle approached the driveway. My hands shook as I opened the door to greet him, and the sight of his uniform, still dusted with the remnants of service, made my heart ache with pride. He was taller, broader, stronger than I remembered, but still the boy I had tucked into bed, the child whose laughter once filled this house. "Mom," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I'm home." I fell into his arms, holding him as tightly as I could, feeling the years of worry, pain, and longing melt away in that single embrace. But the moment was fragile, for we both knew the confrontation that lay ahead. Laura appeared from the hallway, her smile forced, her eyes calculating. "Michael," she said, "you're back early. Everything's fine here." I felt a surge of anger and disbelief. Everything's fine. After months of silent torment, after the manipulation and cruelty, how could she claim that everything was fine? But Michael didn't respond immediately. He walked past her, his eyes fixed on me, and I could see the flicker of understanding, the recognition that something had been hidden from him. Over the next few days, Michael observed. He watched the subtle interactions, the way Laura spoke over me, the way she controlled every aspect of my daily life. He asked questions, gently, cautiously. "Mom, tell me about your days while I was away," he said one evening. And I spoke. I told him everything. The subtle insults, the control, the way she tried to erase me from the home I had built. I spoke of the nights I cried alone, of the quiet endurance that had been my life, of the constant fear that had shadowed every step. Michael listened, his expression darkening with each word. He was silent for a long moment when I finished. Then he said, "I should have known. I should have seen it. Mom, I'm so sorry you had to endure this alone." The confrontation was coming, inevitable and necessary. Michael was no longer a boy, he was a soldier, trained to assess, to act, and to protect. And I, Ruth Anderson, had survived long enough to see that justice was within reach. The tension in the house was palpable. Laura sensed the shift, her smirk faltering as she realized that the son she had assumed oblivious was now fully aware. She tried to maintain control, but her confidence wavered. The first confrontation was inevitable, and the dynamics of our home were about to change forever. The house felt different the moment Michael stepped inside. Cedar Falls, Iowa, with its quiet streets and snow-laden rooftops, no longer seemed serene. It felt charged, as if every wall, every floorboard, had been waiting for this moment. And I had endured months of quiet torment at the hands of a daughter-in-law who sought to dominate my life. But now, justice was about to arrive in the form of my son. Michael's presence changed the energy of the house. Laura, who had ruled every corner with subtle cruelty, sensed the shift immediately. Her movements were precise, her voice practiced, but the confidence that once seemed unshakable had begun to falter. She smiled, but the edges of that smile were sharp, defensive. "Michael," she said, her tone light, but I could see the tension in her eyes, "you're home." "Everything is." "Laura," Michael interrupted, his voice calm but carrying a weight that commanded attention, "we need to talk." Her smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker in her eyes. She had always assumed he would return oblivious, blind to the months of subtle torment she had inflicted. She had assumed I was silent forever. But she had underestimated the bond between mother and son, and the inevitable arrival of truth. I stood quietly, observing, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. Michael had grown so much in my absence, strong, disciplined, composed, but I knew that his patience had limits. I had witnessed Laura's manipulations firsthand, and I understood that confrontation, when it came, could be explosive. Michael turned to me, his eyes softening. "Mom," he said, "I need you to tell me everything. No detail is too small. I want to understand, fully." I nodded, my throat tight. I had prepared for this moment in countless ways, rehearsing what I would say, writing in my journals, documenting every incident, but saying it aloud, with Michael listening, was still terrifying. I took a deep breath and began. I spoke of Laura's subtle cruelties, the way she rearranged my belongings, corrected my cooking, and mocked my habits. I described the nights I cried alone, the isolation I endured, and the constant tension that had pervaded the house. I recounted the passive-aggressive notes, the calculated silences, and the deliberate attempts to erase me from the home I had built with Thomas. Michael listened, silent at first, then with increasing intensity. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, and I could see the anger building beneath his composed exterior. "I can't believe this," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "I should have seen it. I should have known." Laura, who had been standing nearby, attempted to interject. "Michael, that's not." "Don't," he said sharply, cutting her off. His eyes, filled with a mixture of disappointment and determination, locked onto hers. "Mom told me everything. I know what's been happening. And it stops now." The house, which had been silent for so long, seemed to hold its breath. Laura's carefully maintained composure cracked, her defenses faltering under the weight of truth and the presence of the son she had underestimated. "You have no right," she spat, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "I've done nothing wrong." Michael shook his head. "You've tried to erase my mother from her own home. You've manipulated, belittled, and humiliated her. That stops today." I felt a surge of pride mixed with fear. My son, the boy I had raised to be honorable, was standing up not just for me, but for the justice I had been denied. The confrontation I had feared, anticipated, and prepared for was finally here. Laura's anger escalated. She began pacing, her hands flailing, her voice rising. "You don't understand. This is my home now. He chose me, and you." Michael's voice cut through the chaos, firm and unyielding. "This is still your mother's home. And your cruelty will not be tolerated. You will leave this house if you cannot respect her. Do you understand me?" Her face turned pale, her carefully constructed confidence crumbling. For the first time, she realized that the power she had wielded was gone, stripped away by the presence of a son who refused to ignore injustice. I watched, my heart pounding, as Michael stood his ground. He was no longer a child, he was a protector, a soldier in every sense of the word, ready to defend the woman who had given him life. And I, Ruth Anderson, had endured long enough to witness the culmination of months of patience, endurance, and silent strength. The confrontation continued, tense and electric. Words were exchanged, accusations laid bare, and truths revealed. Laura's attempts to manipulate, to excuse her behavior, to assert dominance, all fell flat against Michael's unwavering resolve. He had seen the evidence, read the letters, and understood the depth of the suffering I had endured. And yet, amidst the anger, there was clarity. Michael did not seek to punish out of malice, he sought justice. He sought to restore dignity, to ensure that the home I had built, the life I had protected, was no longer subject to control and cruelty. I felt tears in my eyes, not from fear or sadness, but from a profound sense of relief. The house, once a place of silent torment, was beginning to breathe again. The walls, the floors, the memories, they were witnessing the restoration of justice, the reclaiming of dignity, and the enduring strength of a mother who had survived everything. Laura, defeated and aware of the consequences, retreated, her confidence shattered. Michael turned to me, his eyes softening. "Mom," he said, "you should never have had to endure this alone. I will never let it happen again." I held his hand, feeling the weight of months of silence and endurance lift slightly. "Thank you, Michael," I whispered. "Thank you for coming home." And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Survival is not just about enduring, it is about waiting for the right moment, for the truth to emerge, and for the justice that one has earned through patience and strength. The house, once heavy with tension, began to feel alive again. The snow outside sparkled in the morning light, as if celebrating the restoration of balance, the victory of truth, and the enduring bond between a mother and her son. Because some battles, no matter how silent, reach their climax with the return of justice, the courage to confront, and the love that refuses to be diminished. And some mothers, no matter how quiet, have sons willing to fight for them when the time comes. The calm after the confrontation was deceptive. In Cedar Falls, Iowa, the snow glistened on the streets like a frozen promise of peace, but inside our home, the air was thick with tension, anger, and unresolved power struggles. And I had survived years of subtle torment at the hands of a woman who thought cruelty was a form of control. But I had learned something powerful in those years: endurance does not break, it waits. The confrontation with Michael had shifted everything. Laura, once confident and unyielding, now moved through the house with hesitancy. Her smirks were replaced with thin, forced smiles. Her footsteps, once deliberate and menacing, were now measured, careful, as if she was walking on ice she feared would crack beneath her. But beneath the surface, I could sense the storm gathering. She was not defeated, not truly. She was calculating, waiting for an opening, a chance to regain the control she had lost. Michael, my son, remained vigilant. He had witnessed the manipulation, read the letters, and understood the months of silent suffering I had endured. He had acted not out of anger, but out of justice. And yet, he was human, and I could see the subtle weight of responsibility pressing on him. He was now tasked not only with protecting me but also with managing the storm that Laura could unleash. That evening, as we sat in the living room, Michael's voice broke the heavy silence. "Mom, I want you to feel safe here. I will not let anyone make you feel small again." I reached for his hand, feeling the warmth and strength that had been missing in this home for so long. "Thank you, Michael," I whispered. "I never thought I would see this day." But Laura was watching, and her eyes were sharp. She had retreated to the hallway, and I could sense her planning, scheming. Her cruelty had been subtle before, but I knew from experience that desperation often sharpens the edges of manipulation. The following days brought a tense equilibrium. Laura tried to maintain normalcy, but her attempts were hollow. She smiled at Michael, spoke politely, yet every word carried an undertone of resistance. She wanted to assert control, to prove that the previous confrontation had not defeated her. But Michael remained steadfast, his presence a shield I had longed for. One morning, Laura approached me while I was arranging flowers on the windowsill. Her voice was calm, almost sweet. "Ruth, perhaps we should try to get along. Michael is here now, and we can all coexist peacefully." I looked at her, my expression neutral. "Coexistence is only possible when there is respect, Laura. I have endured years of subtle cruelty, and I will not pretend it did not happen." Her smile faltered for a brief moment, and I knew I had struck a nerve. Laura's manipulations had always relied on fear, on my silent compliance. Confronted with truth and the unwavering support of my son, she was forced to acknowledge that her power had limits. Michael entered the room just then, sensing the tension. He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Mom, we will navigate this together. You are not alone anymore." For the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. The weight of silent endurance, the constant anxiety, began to lift slightly. But the storm was not over. Laura's eyes glinted with something I had seen before: defiance, pride, and a stubborn unwillingness to surrender completely. That night, I reflected on the months of torment, the years of subtle manipulation. I thought of Thomas, my late husband, and the lessons he had taught me about resilience and love. And I realized that survival was not merely about enduring, it was about preparing, documenting, and waiting for justice to arrive in its own time. Michael continued to observe, to protect, and to support. He encouraged me to speak, to reclaim my presence in the home, and to assert my rights as the mother and the one who had built this house with love and care. With his guidance, I began to feel the first stirrings of empowerment in months, a sense that I could exist freely, without fear of ridicule or manipulation. Laura's resistance, however, remained. She would make subtle comments, attempt to isolate me from household decisions, and test the boundaries of her diminished power. Each attempt was met with Michael's calm but firm intervention, creating a dynamic that was both tense and instructive. I watched as the storm within Laura intensified, a maelstrom of pride, frustration, and the realization that her control was permanently diminished. One evening, I overheard a heated argument between Michael and Laura in the kitchen. Her voice was sharp, tinged with desperation. "You can't just take this away from me. I am part of this family." Michael's response was measured but firm. "No one is taking you away, Laura. But cruelty and manipulation will not be tolerated. Respect and fairness are not optional in this home." The confrontation was subtle yet profound, a battle of wills that revealed the strength of character, morality, and love. Laura's anger, though intense, could not overcome the combined resolve of a mother and her son. The storm raged, but its direction had shifted irrevocably. In the quiet moments that followed, I felt a renewed connection with Michael. We shared stories, memories, and reflections that deepened our bond. The house, once a place of isolation and fear, began to resonate with warmth, laughter, and cautious optimism. For the first time in months, I felt hope, a fragile but powerful force that promised healing, justice, and restoration. The storm that followed the confrontation was not merely external, it was internal, a test of endurance, strength, and the bonds of family. And as I sat by the window, watching the snow fall gently on Cedar Falls, I realized that we had weathered the first part of it. The storm within Laura might continue to rage, but it no longer controlled us. We were ready for whatever came next, armed with truth, courage, and the unbreakable bond between mother and son. Because some storms, no matter how fierce, cannot break the foundation of love, justice, and resilience. And some mothers, no matter how quiet, endure until the tempest has passed, standing tall with the support of the children they have raised to fight for what is right. The house felt different now. Cedar Falls, Iowa, dusted in a thick blanket of snow, seemed peaceful from the outside, but inside, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. And I had endured years of subtle torment and manipulation at the hands of a daughter-in-law who believed cruelty was her form of power. But she had underestimated the bond between mother and son, and the inevitability of truth. Laura's confidence had been shaken by Michael's unwavering intervention, but she was not one to surrender quietly. Over the past weeks, I had observed her carefully, noticing every glance, every calculated move. Her patience, too, had limits, and I knew that she would attempt one final effort to assert control, to reclaim what she believed was hers. That morning, the tension was almost tangible. I was arranging flowers in the sunlit kitchen when Laura entered, her posture rigid, her smile tight. "Ruth," she said, her voice deceptively sweet, "perhaps we should talk. Alone. I think there are things that need clarifying." I sensed the trap immediately. This was her last desperate attempt, a calculated effort to isolate me, to regain some semblance of power. But I was no longer the quiet, fearful mother she had tormented for months. With Michael nearby, I felt a strength I hadn't known I possessed. "I'm not going anywhere alone with you," I said firmly, meeting her gaze. "If you want to speak, do it in front of Michael." Her eyes flickered with frustration. "Fine," she said through clenched teeth. "If you insist." The confrontation that followed was electric, tense, and emotionally charged. Laura attempted to justify her actions, claiming that she had only wanted to maintain order, that my presence had been disruptive, and that I had misinterpreted her intentions. Every word she spoke was calculated to diminish, to manipulate, to twist reality in her favor. Michael's presence was unwavering. He listened carefully, his expression a blend of anger, disappointment, and determination. When Laura's justifications became more aggressive, he intervened, his voice calm but unyielding. "Mom endured months of manipulation and cruelty. That is not acceptable. You cannot rewrite the truth to suit your narrative." Her frustration boiled over. She began pacing, her hands flailing, her voice rising. "You don't understand. This is my home. He chose me." Michael's eyes darkened. "You were wrong. This is our home. This is Ruth's home. Your cruelty stops now." The intensity of the confrontation escalated. Laura's words became sharper, her insults more pointed, her desperation palpable. But she was facing a force she could not overcome, a son who had witnessed the suffering of his mother, who had read her letters, and who had learned the depth of her endurance. I stood quietly, observing, feeling a mix of relief, fear, and anticipation. The house that had been my prison was finally a stage for justice. The confrontation was not just about power, it was about recognition, respect, and the reclamation of dignity. As Laura's anger reached its peak, she made one final attempt to dominate. "You think you've won. You can't take this from me. I am part of this family." Michael's response was unwavering. "You are part of this family only if you respect it. You will not undermine, manipulate, or belittle the people who live here. That ends today." Her face turned pale, her carefully maintained confidence shattered. She realized that her control was gone, and with it, the influence she had wielded over our lives. The storm within her raged, but it no longer controlled us. After a long, tense silence, Laura finally left the room, her departure a tacit acknowledgement of defeat. The house, once heavy with tension, seemed to exhale, releasing the weight of months of silent suffering. Michael turned to me, his eyes softening. "Mom, you are safe now. I promise you that." I felt tears welling up, not from fear or sadness, but from relief and profound gratitude. The battle was not just external, it had been internal, a test of endurance, courage, and the unbreakable bond between mother and son. That evening, as snow fell gently outside, I reflected on the months of torment, the letters exchanged, and the confrontation that had finally restored balance. I realized that my survival had not been passive, it had been active, deliberate, and resilient. I had endured, documented, and waited for the moment when justice would arrive, and it had. Michael and I sat together, sharing memories, laughter, and quiet reflections. The bond between us had deepened, strengthened by shared experiences, mutual respect, and the knowledge that we had overcome adversity together. The house, once a place of fear, was beginning to feel like home again. Because some battles, no matter how prolonged, end with the triumph of truth, courage, and love. And some mothers, no matter how quiet, endure until justice is restored, standing tall with the children they have raised to fight for what is right. The morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and golden, spilling across the walls of Cedar Falls, Iowa. For the first time in months, the house felt peaceful, not merely quiet. My name is Ruth Anderson, and today, I finally breathed freely in the home I had built, endured, and loved. The confrontation with Laura had changed everything. Her attempts to manipulate and dominate had been met with unwavering truth, justice, and the protective presence of my son, Michael. The house, which had felt like a prison, was now a sanctuary once more, alive with the warmth of restored balance and dignity. Michael had handled the aftermath with the precision and calm of a soldier. He ensured that boundaries were set, responsibilities clarified, and respect established. Laura, now fully aware that her power was permanently diminished, had retreated, her presence reduced to civility without dominance. She could no longer control or intimidate, and the home belonged, unequivocally, to the people who had earned it, me and my son. Sitting in the living room, I watched Michael move around, attending to the house, checking details I had long overlooked, and making small changes that spoke of his presence, care, and protection. He paused to glance at me, his eyes soft, filled with both pride and relief. "Mom," he said, "you're finally safe. No one will make you feel small here again." I smiled, tears welling in my eyes. "Thank you, Michael. I never thought I'd see this day." He reached out and took my hand. "You endured so much, Mom. And now, it's time to enjoy the life you deserve. You are not invisible. You are not powerless. You are my mother, and I will always protect you." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I believed him. I believed that the nightmare of manipulation, cruelty, and silent suffering had ended. That the home I had once feared had become a place of peace, laughter, and dignity again. In the days that followed, Michael and I rebuilt our routines. We shared meals without tension, laughed together, and even planned small outings in the town that had once seemed indifferent to my suffering. Every interaction, every shared moment, reinforced the bond that adversity had strengthened rather than broken. Laura's presence became distant, limited to polite interactions devoid of the power she had once wielded. She no longer attempted to dominate or belittle, she had recognized that her tactics were ineffective against the combined resilience of a mother and the protective love of a son. Her defeat was complete, quiet, but undeniable. I found myself reflecting on the months of endurance that had led to this moment. Every insult, every manipulation, every attempt to erase me had tested my strength. And yet, through it all, I had survived, documented, and waited for justice to arrive. Michael's return, his unwavering support, and his readiness to confront cruelty had transformed my survival into triumph. The house began to feel alive again. The walls, which had absorbed tension and fear, now resonated with warmth, hope, and love. I could move freely, speak openly, and reclaim the spaces that had once been mine in principle but denied to me in practice. I had endured silently for months, but now I could exist fully, without fear or apology. One afternoon, as Michael and I sat by the window, watching the snow melt and the sunlight dance across the streets of Cedar Falls, I felt a profound sense of peace. "You've changed this house, Michael," I said softly. "You've restored something I thought I had lost forever." He smiled, his eyes reflecting both relief and quiet pride. "We did it together, Mom. You taught me patience, endurance, and strength. I only helped ensure justice was done. You earned peace. Now you deserve to live in it fully." The truth, long hidden, had finally emerged. Laura's attempts to manipulate, control, and dominate were no match for the bond between a mother and her son, the resilience that comes from years of endurance, and the inevitable arrival of justice. In the quiet evenings that followed, I often sat with Michael, sharing stories of the past, dreams for the future, and reflections on the challenges we had overcome. The house, once heavy with fear, now held memories of triumph, resilience, and the restored dignity of a woman who had survived. I thought of the lessons learned: patience is strength, endurance is power, and truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually prevail. The mother who had once felt invisible now felt seen, valued, and protected. The son who had witnessed the suffering of his mother had become not only a protector but also a guardian of justice. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Michael turned to me. "Mom, we've faced the storm. We've endured the battle, and now, we can finally live in peace. You've earned it, and I'll ensure it lasts." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you, Michael, for everything, for seeing me, for protecting me, and for restoring what was lost. I can finally breathe." And in that moment, I understood the true meaning of endurance, justice, and love. The trials, the cruelty, and the fear had all led to this moment of triumph. The home that had once been a place of torment was now a sanctuary. The bond between mother and son, forged through adversity, had proven unbreakable. Because some mothers, no matter how quiet, endure until justice is restored. And some sons, guided by love, courage, and honor, fight for that justice until peace is reclaimed. The storm had passed. The silence had been shattered by truth. The cruelty had been met with courage. And at last, Ruth Anderson could live freely, loved, and unafraid, in the home she had built, endured, and now truly reclaimed.